I'm Professor Kim Lead, and I'm a teaching faculty member in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at UNC. And I've had the pleasure of teaching or getting to know most of our panelists in the HIVE Lab or in our LMC curricula over the years, both as a graduate student in the PhD program at UNC and now as faculty. But before I turn things over to Sarah, I just wanted to give everyone who's with us a little bit of context about what we mean when we say the HIVE Lab and sort of what we're all about and how this all relates to what we're going to talk about tonight. So the HIVE Lab is it is a research lab for health humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. But I also like to think of it as a hub for curricula and programming. So we have a team of researchers, of faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students who work on collaborative projects. And I hope that Maebelle will talk a little bit about one of those projects that she did as an undergrad, and I believe Anne was also involved in some of our HIVE Lab research, so you can get a sense of that from some of our alumni. But we also are connected to a lot of different curricula. So we have connections with the honors minor in medicine, literature, and culture, and teach a lot of the courses related to that. The English major also has a concentration called Science, Medicine, and Literature that includes a lot of the same courses, but obviously with a little bit more of a literary studies focus. And then for folks who are really excited about health humanities and especially English, we have an accelerated track towards our master's program called the BAMA, dual degree program in English. Also with that concentration, this time in literature, medicine, and culture, we really like to keep everybody on their toes in terms of all of our acronyms. And if there happen to be a few graduate students in the room, we also have a master's program and a graduate certificate now. So you really can get tapped into health humanities coursework and curricula at all levels of your career at UNC. And this career panel is part of a growing set of our programming. Especially this year, we've been focusing on connecting with undergraduate students who have interests, of course, in health humanities, but also in other areas as well, to think about how humanities and health sciences can intersect and really make for some productive conversations and opportunities in a variety of careers. So that's part of our goal here today. We'll also have a personal statement workshop later, I believe in April 6th, I believe. I'll double check that and get it in the chat. I see a thumbs up from Sarah. We host a Grand Round series with speakers from all over who do research in health humanities. And we support the Health Humanities Journal especially for the undergrads in the room who've done some research or writing related to health or healthcare. We welcome your submissions to the Health Humanities Journal as well. Okay, so our plan for today is to speak with a few alumni of UNC who have gone on to a range of different healthcare related fields. I'm going to let the panelists all introduce themselves, but just know that these are all folks who in some way or another have been connected with some of the health humanities curricula and programming and even research here at UNC. So I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Lostrom. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and our HIVE Lab career coach to take it away.
So we will go ahead and just jump right in. The first thing that I'm going to have each panelist do is just go ahead and introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what you do now, what you did at UNC, how you were involved with the HIVE Lab, and where you're at. So let's see, how about we start with Hannah?
My name is Hannah Wild. I'm currently a nurse in the surgical trauma ICU at Atrium in Charlotte. I took 3 or 4 classes with Kim on like intro to fiction and a bunch of, I ended up getting my medical anthropology minor. So I got to learn a lot about illness narrative. And that's kind of what my big takeaway was from HIVE Lab and being involved there. So my work kind of in health now is if you were to get into a big car crash or we see a lot of shooting victims, you come up to me, and I work on that critical care clinical side, but I'm also working on integrating spiritual care into our works with all of our critical care patients. So that's kind of my humanities side right now in the clinical setting.
Amazing. Thank you, Hannah. I will definitely want to ask you more about what that integration process looks like and has been looking like for you. How about Natalie? Do you mind going next?
Sure. So my name's Natalie. I am a genetic counselor, which you guys may or may not know is a field that exists. I work at the National Institutes of Health up in DC. So I work on a couple of different research protocols, one on patients with super rare autoinflammatory disorders where they get fevers, rashes, inflammation for seemingly no reason, and we try to find the genetic cause. And then I also work with a disease where people are at a higher risk of developing leukemia throughout their life. So I graduated from UNC in 2015, and I got my minor in medicine, literature, and culture. I don't think the HHIVE Lab existed at that point, which it sounds like a very cool opportunity. So I took a ton of courses in different narratives on illness, disability perspectives, which definitely influenced my career. And then I also was able to do a Birch Fellowship that was very based in like medical anthropology, which has definitely guided a lot of my career. Yeah, so that's me.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Maebelle.
Hi, I'm Maebelle. I graduated from UNC in 2019, and now I am a medical student back here at UNC. So I was involved in the HHIVE Lab. I worked on the tail end of the Writing Diabetes Project and helped bring the Dancing Diabetes Project to life. I think I started off in the medicine, literature, and culture minor, but then I ended up making my own major in the interdisciplinary studies program. That was kind of like an application to the health humanities, kind of personally tailored major. And then after I graduated, I served in AmeriCorps for a year as a behavioral health care manager at a family medicine clinic, which is really cool. And then I came back down here.
And Anne.
Hello, I'm Anne. I'm a fourth year medical student at Harvard right now. I graduated back in 2018. Similar to Maebelle, I did the interdisciplinary studies major and wrote my honors thesis on vaccine skepticism, which was surprisingly prescient considering the issues that are going on right now. But I'm currently applying into ear, nose, and throat. And will be a resident studying and working on and taking care of things that have absolutely nothing to do with vaccinating children, but it's definitely still something that's near and dear to my heart.
Wow, I can't believe that was something that you wrote your honors thesis on right before the onset of COVID. That's
yeah. I mean, in fairness, it was on MMR, which is like not really the same thing, but yeah, it was weirdly topical and it's come up in residency interviews. So surprise.
You have some predictive capabilities. Okay, thank you so much to all of our lovely panelists for giving those introductions. We're going to go ahead and shift into the conversation portion of this. So I have a few general questions for each of you. So the first one is just asking a little bit about what your day-to-day proceedings really look like for each of your jobs, for each of your positions that you currently hold, and what you really like about your job. So we'll go around similar to the way that we just did, and you guys can answer that question. So we'll start again with Hannah.
Okay, so I will come in at dark 30 to the hospital and get my patient assignment. I'll get 2 to 3 depending on how short staffed we are, and with COVID that is very depending. The type of patients I see varies day to day, which I really, really like about my job. I'll see some people who've had like a very traumatic cancer where we will take some pieces of their face or throat, or we'll have someone who's had gunshots to the head or anything. So the type of patients I get to see are very all across the board, which I really appreciate. And then for the next 12 hours, depending on how sick they are, I'll be titrating medications, collaborating with physicians. With my current position, I get to kind of work at the top of my scope of practice as a nurse, and the physicians rely on what I'm seeing because they have 30 to 40 patients where I have 2. So I'm making a lot of recommendations, and in a lot of cases, putting in orders and letting them know what I'm doing, and helping them kind of guide what they want to do surgically, or letting them know, oh, we're getting close to somebody losing their life. I need people up here. So it's like never a dull moment up in the ICU. And another big part of the role as a nurse, as opposed to like a physician, is we get to be the patient advocate and get to be the person who talks to that patient or talks to that family all day. Whereas the providers just don't have a chance to be able to do that because they're handling so much other clinical things that we don't even begin to understand. So one of the big things I'm trying to infiltrate into the ICU is collaborating spiritual care, which Atrium encompasses a lot of just like a patient advocate or a hand to hold. Because as a nurse, while it's my role to be that patient advocate and be that shoulder to cry on and figure out what's going on at home as well as in the hospital, it's hard to switch from that clinical mindset to that caregiver mindset. So trying to figure out, why does that person think they have cancer, or why does that person think everything's going on, and figuring all that out, and being able to have other people help on that caregiver side is one of my spearheads in my clinical ladder projects going in right now. So along with being clinical and running codes and everything, I also am trying to spearhead that caregiver aspect, which I think I got a lot from my HIVE training and all the classes I got from UNC.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like from a purely communication standpoint, you have to bridge a lot of divides between both the patients and the physicians, and you're in this in-between position, which sounds like it would be extremely rewarding and also extremely challenging and taxing. So I'm definitely interested to hear more about how your HIVE experience has really shown up in your job a little later in the conversation. But what's something that you like about your job?
I feel like when I tell some people this, it feels like sound weird, but I get to be that person that gets to be there for somebody on the worst day of their life and hold somebody's hand, and that in most cases just is the most rewarding experience. And I can't brag more about my hospital. We have the best teamwork in the whole wide world.
That's amazing. And also I appreciate what you said too about how physicians more often than not have 30 to 40 patients on their schedule at any given time, so they're unable to spend a certain amount of time with the patient, whereas you get to really develop, for better or worse. I'm sure it's also very painful, especially in the floor or the area of the hospital that you work in. You get to develop more sustained relationships with the patients and their families, which is incredible. Thank you, Hannah. Moving on to Natalie.
Yeah, so I was trying to think what a typical day looks like for me, and they're always very different. I feel like there are some days where I wear my genetics, science, biology major hat, and I'm looking through data, trying to identify new genes that might explain my patient's symptoms, or working with bioinformaticians or, scientists in our lab. But then I spend a lot of my time being a counselor. So my degree, my master's degree is in counseling. So I work with families to help them, one, to understand their family history and look for clues in their story that might get us to a diagnosis. I do a lot of giving people diagnoses and helping them adapt to that diagnosis, understanding how it's going to impact their life moving forward, and kind of helping people adapt to having a rare disease, which can be really difficult. Yeah, and it's, sometimes that's me having conversations with patients on my own, and sometimes it's working more collaboratively with the other providers on our team, which is, I think, something I love, is being able to work with a lot of different people.
It sounds like you and Hannah in some ways occupy a similar position of being with people on what could potentially be the worst day or one of the most difficult days of their lives. And you have to navigate providing clinical care or more, data-driven care, so to speak, and also being a human being who is like, I'm going to be here with you and try and help you through this really, really brutal experience that you're having and that you're about to have. So that sounds, I love that you got your master's in counseling and that you're carrying that into this like more, what people would understand as a more like scientific or data-driven job, but you also have this background in providing a certain level of emotional care, which I think is in a lot of ways what HIVE is about as well. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Maebelle.
So I might let Anne talk a little bit more about being a medical student and talk a little bit more of my role as a behavioral healthcare manager, because I think it was a really unique opportunity, and I just want to share that with people. So I guess like a little bit of background on that role. It was a 1-year AmeriCorps program in something called the National Health Corps, which was like mostly geared at public health kind of service. And some of those positions were more in the clinic, like healthcare oriented, and some were much more like public health oriented and might be more administrative or doing health education and like that. But because I knew I wanted to go to medical school eventually, I chose to do a more clinic oriented one. So my role basically entailed of kind of being the liaison between patients and their doctors, specifically for patients with depression. So they would come, they would meet with their doctors and maybe get started on a new treatment or be diagnosed or just be along their treatment journey. And I would check in, visits to see how things were going. If their medications were okay for them, just like talk to them, help them work through any challenges they might be facing, and help connect them to like whatever resources they might need about coming back into the clinic, or like other resources in the community that I could help partner them with, which was also like, it's difficult to have those conversations because it's a pretty private moment. I'm kind of cold calling people and asking them to be vulnerable with someone they've maybe never met. But it was just a really unique and cool experience. And I think I learned a lot from it, and I got to like make some wonderful connections with people. And then the National Health Corps, on top of that, I got to like do education sessions and learn more about the city of Pittsburgh and like do career training to kind of help me be more prepared for a healthcare or public health type of role. So all in all, a very cool opportunity.
Yeah, and again, similar to Hannah and Natalie, it seems like, again, you are serving as this sort of bridge, this connective bridge between this like more clinical aspect of things and providing that level of care, but also, again, providing a certain level of emotional care and just like human connection with people during extremely vulnerable times, right? Any health issue or any health crisis. Honestly, no matter how big or how small, it can feel really vulnerable. Like even just going to the doctor is uncomfortable for a lot of people. So yeah, amazing. I am glad that you're sharing about your AmeriCorps program, because we definitely want to hear about that. Anne, take it away.
All right, so I took the most boring and linear course possible in my journey toward medical school and being a doctor. So I have no fun stories to share aside from what medical school is like, which is that it's school. I mean, every curriculum is a little different, but everyone will go through some version of classroom learning where you learn a lot of stuff and forget a lot of it before you go into the clinics for a year and rotate through all the different specialties and meet lots of cool doctors and residents and nurses and assorted healthcare professionals, and take care of your own patients, which is a really cool learning process. And then, along the way, this is really where the curricula diverge for us. We do like we have a lot of time after we do our clinical year. We do it earlier than most schools. And so we have opportunities to do advanced clinical electives, do some research, kind of just whatever floats your boat going forward. I guess in terms of something that might be a little less readily apparent is what otolaryngologists do, which I feel like until I say that I'm applying into ENT, most people, like, I get one of two reactions. Either I have no idea what that is, or, oh my gosh, I have so many sinus issues. Let me tell you about them. Like, there is no in between. But basically, we take care of any problems in the body that happen above the collarbones, aside from things with the brain, which neurosurgery takes care of, and neurologists, and things with the eye, which ophthalmologists take care of. So, anything from like ear tubes and tonsils up to really horrible, crazy head and neck cancers where you reconstruct with like various bones and tissue from other parts of the body. We kind of do it all. And we get to take care. I guess like there are so many favorite parts of the job. Like all of it's great. I guess kind of more uniquely to what I do compared to what the rest of you all do is we get to operate as surgeons. And the OR is definitely a very unique experience. If you have any interest in kind of like hands-on activity, but I think more so, a personal emphasis on not just answering questions of diagnosis, which is a lot of what a lot of internal medicine and non-surgical medicine really focuses on, but really focusing on, okay, the diagnosis is pretty self-evident, but what are we going to do about it? I think it's very suited to the surgery personality, and you get to have a lot of fun and work really closely with your colleagues while doing it.
Amazing, thank you. And it's not boring at all. We want to hear about that day-to-day ritual, because so many people, I'm sure, who either will be watching this panel later or who are here in attendance today are interested in medical school, and they want to know what that looks like. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to ask and dig into a little bit more how your experience with HIVE, how your time at UNC is informing your current career and how it helps you shape your career path. So not only how it's showing up in the career that you currently have, but how it's helped shape that process. So we'll head back to Hannah.
So I think the biggest thing I took away from my UNC HIVE curriculum classes was that learning how to figure out how to develop an illness narrative and what exactly that was. I know you don't really get any of that training in nursing school. It's very clinically driven, and you get, I think, one class where you're like, oh, you're a patient advocate and figure out the holistic aspect of somebody's care. But until you're actually there, you really don't get any of that. So being there, being next to somebody on the worst day of their lives, and specifically with my population being like a good 10% are probably coming from a prison because they've been shanked or whatever, trying to figure out, okay, why do you think that you have that, or what's going on holistically, because we found other issues in those patients. Or on a more religious side, we have people who think, oh, God gave me cancer and all of that, and trying to navigate that whole process. And patients who can't talk, those, because they have a breathing tube in, and communicating with those families, that's a whole nother illness narrative that I think isn't talked about. So being able to kind of take that whole human and figure out why they think they have this illness or this injury, and how we need to treat it as a whole person versus just clinically. I think specifically because of all of that training I got at UNC, I'm kind of our behavioral health or our crazy patient go-to, and I will get all of our people that nobody else can kind of handle, and they just need, all the other nurses will just kind of sedate them and figure out. And that's ultimately why they continue to be in the ICU, is because we can't control them safely. And so I get to be that person who ultimately has to work with them for 1 or 2 weeks, just me, and figuring out, okay, we need to talk about what you think's going on. How do we need to get out of these restraints? And how do we get this breathing tube out? Because you need to be safe before we can do any of that. So kind of all of that training I got at UNC really has shaped how I approach my clinical practice.
I also wanted to ask about how the process of integrating spiritual care, what that's looked like for you, and what are some of the challenges that have come up with that? Because it seems like that wouldn't necessarily be a seamless process, a seamless transition, because you are trying to balance a lot of needs. Or if it has been, less challenging, then how so?
It has definitely not been seamless. I think staffing is our big issue. And then when you say, oh, I think I'm going to consult spiritual care on any type of patient, having them understand that doesn't mean, oh, this priest is going to come up and talk to me, and having them understand what that role is, has been difficult. Having them understand that these people are so smart and can cover Hinduism, Buddhism, or literally just be there for a hand to hold, because as much as I can try and be there for somebody, if I have a patient who is close to death and actively coding, or their heart stopping, I can't take off my clinical hat and put on my caregiver hat. So having someone be like, okay, like there's a lot of feelings in the room, I just can't switch back and forth, bringing somebody else in. It's hard for patients and family members to understand that this isn't just shoving religion down their throat. And it's hard for providers to kind of get on board as well, because in some of their training too, they're just kind of apt to see the palliative side or the end of life care. So collaborating on what do we need specifically and what all of our roles are.
Yeah, and considering how it's obviously an asset to the patient, and it's also an asset to you as a nurse, that you, like you said, you can't constantly be shifting back and forth. When that happens, one of those roles inevitably gets sacrificed in the quality of the care that you're providing. So thinking of it as like an additional supplemental resource, not only to the patients, but to the physicians and nurses as well. Awesome. I do want to shift to Natalie.
All right. I was laughing while Hannah was talking, because I also get sent all of the really difficult patients, like everybody that nobody wants to talk to. So maybe that's what UNC prepares you for. So I think similar to Hannah, is really learning how to understand somebody's story, how their illness or whatever we're doing with them fits within the context of their life. I think about this, a lot. Like, I was working with a patient today who bleeds really easily. And, while I know he's supposed to get a bone marrow biopsy every year and blood tests and all of this stuff, the stuff that's important to him was he was never allowed to play sports as a kid because they were worried he'd bleed out. He wasn't allowed to have a tattoo. So we had a long conversation about figuring out whether he now, as a grown adult, can have a tattoo, because that's something that's really important. It's sort of, understanding that context of people as a person beyond a diagnosis and trying to structure things within their own life. I think, I learned how to ask a lot more questions of my patients, and sort of approach things as a detective, as an interviewer, as a writer, to kind of get their story and then be able to tell their story to other providers that I work with. The other thing I was thinking about just came in and went. Yeah, I think that was kind of the main thing. Oh, I guess kind of understanding more perspectives that are beyond my own opinion. So a lot of what I work with is people deciding whether or not to do genetic testing, whether or not to participate in research, whether or not they should do certain procedures. And, I feel like for me, I kind of have this gut, like, this is what I would do, this is what I would do. But having the background in literature and stories and being exposed to a lot of different philosophies in undergrad, I think, I can see more opinions or more approaches, and have been able to step back and be a little bit more of a non-directive provider, and meeting my patients where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about part of asking more questions is developing a more nuanced understanding and being able to share that more nuanced understanding of what a patient's narrative or story is. And part of that is not writing it yourself, like not making those assumptions of like, okay, well, I have my own biases about X, Y, and Z. So this like fine line between asking all these questions and help building this story and understand that, and at the same time being like, okay, I need to take myself out of this a little bit, and remember that this is not, you know, my life, my body, whatever. So absolutely, I can definitely see how that's mapped onto like literature and humanities, like epistemology and way of thinking. Yeah. Maebelle.
Yeah, I think HHIVE Lab and Health Humanities has actually really guided why I want to be a doctor one day. Before I came to UNC, I was like, oh, I want to help people and science is cool and I'm good at it. And then I took medicine, literature, and culture, and I took medical sociology and all the health humanities classes. And I was like, there's so much more that goes into a person's health than just the science of it all and the medications and what I heard about till now. And I think that made me a lot more passionate about wanting to be a doctor and wanting to build longitudinal relationships with patients one day and like actually get to know them and all of the things that are important to them and contribute to their health. That's not just science or the disease. And so that's kind of really guided almost all the decisions I made concerning like medical school and what steps I've taken next. Since then, I've gotten interested in the public health. I want MPH at some point because I think that is another field that kind of looks at the big picture and social determinants of health and how people's healths are impacted besides like individual choices or, again, the science of it all. It's why I decided to serve in AmeriCorps, because it was a way to kind of continue learning about everything that kind of makes a person and a unique way to do service and learn about that at the same time. And like now when I'm in medical school and as I go into rotations, I think I'd be really looking for mentors and like doctors who kind of feel and practice the same way. And I think UNC is really good about that. Like all the medical students I know, and a lot of the faculty are great about that. So just from them and learning how to incorporate that into the doctor I will one day be.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I think that something that came up for me when listening to you speak too is thinking about my own like health humanities courses that I've taken, and one of the like big questions that I was always returning to in those courses was, what is health? Like how do we even begin to understand what health is or what well-being is, because it looks so radically different for so many people, and to apply a standardized definition is really difficult. Especially when you do take into account all of these different social determinants of what contributes to health or contributes to a lack of health. So I love what you said about kind of thinking more broadly about like, okay, well, how do we even begin to understand what health is or what well-being is? I think in particular, that latter one is in some ways even more difficult to parse out, of like, because people have very different definitions of what well-being is in their life. So I love that, thinking about this holistic understanding of a person, and that also includes expanding definitions of what health and well-being actually look like, right? Anne, take it away.
All right, so I guess a couple of things come to mind. I guess first of all, most of the research that I do now is on patient-reported outcomes, which is certainly not a field that's exclusive to people in the humanities, but basically it focuses on, like, when you think about surgical outcomes, there's kind of two ways to think about it. One, there's morbidity and mortality, right, which is complications, people dying, God forbid, from surgery. And then there's sort of the more subjective experience of patient-reported outcomes, which is basically more about how have your symptoms improved? Like, in the case of sinus surgery, is your congestion less bothersome? Like, do you feel like you're able to participate more in your day-to-day life, and so on and so forth. For sleep apnea, it could be, do you feel like you're waking up a little more awake than before, as opposed to like maybe how your sleep study results come out. And I mean, in a lot of ways, that's kind of what narrative medicine is about, right? It's about what the patient tells themselves is the story of their illness and how the story of how they recovered has come to be. And so much of that has to do with how they experience that transition from pre-treatment to post-treatment, right? Like, just for us to pat ourselves in the back for taking out someone's tonsils without them bleeding to death is kind of ridiculous, because it's such a non-morbid procedure. But more importantly, we need to think about, does this actually, like, some poor patient went under anesthesia, let us put a knife to them. They should be getting something out of it. And it shouldn't be something that we see on a radiograph and say, cool, great. It should be something that actually meaningfully improves their quality of life. And I think, it's not necessarily like a traditionally humanities-y research area, but it certainly does interact with sort of the underlying philosophies of narrative medicine. Couple of other things. I mean, we do, as doctors, we do a lot of discussions on end-of-life care, and I'm sure Hannah can speak toward how that's salient in the SICU, as well as patients get really sick, making sure that we understand what their goals of care are. And I mean, that, in some ways, that's also just an illness narrative. It's what they see themselves going forward, what they want for their life, and getting good at eliciting those stories and making sure that we listen critically. And then sort of what your additional training as a physician imparts is an ability to give advice on how medical management can subsequently get you to your goals and create that narrative that you want for your time remaining. I mean, I think that's really it.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up this really crucial idea of not only the like pre-operation status or even the operation status, but also like, what does recovery look like? What does aftercare look like? And I think that isn't always the most shiny thing to think about or talk about, but it's obviously crucial to any like health procedure and form of healthcare. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that in the context of contributing to a more complete and nuanced and holistic understanding of what someone actually wants. Like, what does someone want their recovery to look like? And what are they hoping to get out of whatever procedure, like you mentioned, getting your tonsils out? Like, what should that actually accomplish? Because that might look different for different people. So thinking about what the outcome should be and providing care through the whole process, not just the most shiny or exciting part, so to speak. Yeah. So I have one more question for all of you before we shift to some individual questions. And I think this will probably be a little bit quicker. But if you could just give like a brief rundown of how you found your job, what was the application and interview process like? What qualities were your employers looking for? I think it's helpful to kind of walk through some of the nitty-gritty of the job process, because I think that a lot of the attendees here tonight and whoever might watch this panel recording afterwards, that's part of what they're looking for. And as Ermac did, if anyone has any questions at any point, feel free to jump in. We will have a time towards the end of the conversation for participants to ask any questions that they want, but if something is burning on the tip of your tongue, just jump right in, and that's not a problem. So why don't we start with Hannah again? Just tell us a little bit about how you found this job and what that process was like.
Okay. So I was primarily looking for a nursing residency. So I think a lot of people don't think that, or a lot of people associate a residency with doctors, but nurses have residencies as well. So not every hospital provides a nursing residency. So I was looking for those new graduate ones, and Atrium happened to have one. You can look into different specialties. So I applied for the OR and critical care residency. You then go through a first round where you talk to HR and make sure you're a good fit for the hospital and everything. You'll then go to the specific unit that you are applying for. And you'll have, my specific unit had me and 10 of the current staff nurses, supervisors, and the manager. So it was me against 10 people type of interview. And you sit down, see if that's a good personality fit. And if they kind of see if you can have what it takes a lot of times, because each different health specialty requires a different type of personality. So I personally know that I definitely do not have the personality to go into pediatrics. Like that is something I could never do. So it's just kind of figuring out where your personality fits in all of that. And I thankfully passed and then entered a year-long residency before I started being a nurse on my own.
Awesome. Thank you. Natalie.
Yeah, so it was funny. I think I went through most of college not knowing what a genetic counselor was. I had one of my genetics professors actually, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, did I want to go to med school? That didn't seem like the right fit. Did I want to do a PhD in biology? He was like, I could really see you being a genetic counselor. And I was like, nah, that's like pregnant ladies and diagnosing Down syndrome. Like that's cool, but not me. So after I graduated from UNC, I did a post-bac at the NIH where I ended up in a genetics lab. Spoiler alert, it's the lab that I work in now. So it's a 2-year internship where I was kind of doing genetic testing and then getting to see patients in the clinic, just through observation, and met a genetic counselor on a different research protocol and was just like, that's the coolest job in the world. Like it just clicked. And then I had to email my UNC professor and be like, Corbin, you were right, shoot. But from there, I applied to grad school and ended up going to Stanford, and they were very confused and impressed by my application from UNC because it was like hard bench science plus all of this random medicine, literature, culture stuff, stuff in India, my classes in literature and all of the above. But I think it definitely was something that helped get me into school, was sort of having that very unique perspective. And then when I graduated, I came straight back to the same lab at the NIH. I loved kind of having a more unique role in genetics than working prenatal. Prenatal is super cool. I love my rotations, but not my thing. So I like kind of having the ability to be doing a lot of research and being very involved in finding new diseases, while also being a counselor and having that sort of patient perspective.
Absolutely. That feels very true to life, that you swear off something and you're like, no, I'd never be interested in this. That's absurd. And then like 2 years go by and you're like, this is my life now. So I love that path for you. Maebelle, you're welcome to talk about what the process is like for applying to the AmeriCorps fellowship. You're also welcome to talk about what the process is like for applying to UNC for med school, either, both, whatever feels good to you.
Maybe I will let Anne do the general medical school application process, if that's okay. And I can talk a little bit about what interviewing at UNC was like. But I'll start with AmeriCorps. So I was looking for things to do for my gap year, and I was Googling things that was related to service and was clinical related because I knew I needed some more patient experience and maybe a little public health mix in there, and happened to stumble upon the National Health Corps. And I looked through their, just like the information on their website and some of the positions that they had to offer. And I was like, this is really cool. So then the application process itself was, I think it was like a personal statement and answering a couple of questions. And then you would send that out to all the different locations that National Health Corps was active at. So at the time it was Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, North Florida, and Chicago. So kind of random, but those are the locations that they offered. Since then, they've added New York and San Francisco. And so after I submitted those applications, I started getting calls for interviews. So then I entered with each of those locations, just like the staff there, to see if I would be a good fit in their cohort. And then once they accepted me there, I base ranked which is their position. So like at the various clinics or health departments or whatnot were most interesting to me, and then interviewed with those specifically. So it was a bit long, but and I ended up being somewhere where they wanted me and I wanted them. So it was like a great way to find a good fit. Exactly. And I think, like, I remember my personal statement, I specifically talked about like, what is the difference between illness and disease? Because I think that was one big takeaway I had from HIVE and the medicine, literature, and culture classes I took. And I remember talking to my boss later, and he was like, that was like actually one part of your essay that really intrigued us, like that you were thoughtfully thinking more holistically and like about those differences. So I think that made a big difference. And then for UNC, I think I also talked about illness versus disease and my experience with the diabetes and my personal statement, and then went through writing secondaries, which Anne will probably talk about more. And then the AU interview was just kind of having a conversation with a faculty member about my experiences, why they were important to me, why I want to do medicine and be at UNC specifically. And then so a couple of stations, which are called MMIs. I forget what they stand for, but basically we walked in and we either had like a fake patient where we were just kind of talking to them about whatnot, whatever the scenario was, and you were in there for 7 minutes and then you left and you went on to the next one, or it was kind of 1 or 2 interview questions that you just like kind of talked about with a random person and you just rotated around. So that was what that experience was like.
Thank you. That was all really helpful to know. Anne, go for it.
Great. So I, like, full disclosure, I just went through residency interviews. So Maebelle, please correct me if I say something wrong and I like completely mix up what applying for residency and applying for med school were like, because it's been a while. But oh yeah, okay. And I'm happy to talk about the residency process and like just the black box that is medical school. So you come in as a little baby freshman in college, right? At some point along the way, you take the MCAT. And fill all of your prerequisites that you can like Google from the internet. And during the summer between junior and senior year, you apply for medical school. So this has several stages, which Maebelle alluded to. There's the primary application, which is where you like fill out all your activities, your grades, etc. And you have something called the personal statement, which is like X number of characters where you wax poetic about like basically why you want to be a doctor. And you tell your story, so on and so forth. I actually like reflecting on my medical school personal statement and my residency personal statement. The way I framed my residency personal statement was almost like a sequel to my medical school one. It was actually really cute because the first one I kind of talked about like, you know, my coming to like, you know, I had a very like strong like basic science background and I took more LMC classes and that got to focus a little more on the patient experience and thinking more about, you know, patient stories and so on and so forth. And then my residency interview actually like it very much had to do with like, I mean, I picked ENT partly because like I'm happy in pretty much any OR I'm in. Like from a surgical perspective, I'd be happy in any subspecialty, but it's really the questions, the problems, the stories of the patients within ENT that I find really compelling and really interesting because the head and neck is like the part of the body that you use to communicate with the world. And so much of, you know, the way people perceive your face. I actually, in the first paragraph, brought in the autobiography of a face by Lucy Greeley that I read in Dr. Threlkill's class. And so it was just like this nice little, like you learn all these tricks about like pretty literary devices that like make your little circular narrative sound wonderful and well packaged. And I think that's like also something that I took away from just taking a bunch of English courses. Because actually at one of my residency interviews, someone said, your personal statement was exquisite. And I was like, wow, the highest compliment, truly, especially since they barely read those things. They just skim them. Anyway, all that aside, so you turn in your personal statement and your primary application. The next step is secondaries, which is basically you pay a lot of money so that medical schools each get a series of customized essays that they choose. They vary from very short, like 1 paragraph on why you want to go here, to Duke's monstrosity of like, I swear I wrote like 7 pages of secondaries for Duke Medical School. So like just emotionally prepare yourself for that if you apply there. I don't know if it's changed. Someone can update you guys, but oh, it has not changed. All right, well, so that is the way that is. And so you turn in all these secondaries, you send them off to the schools. My piece of advice for this is get your primary and your secondary in as early as possible. But for the secondary, people will be like, turn it around in 2 weeks, turn it around in 4 weeks, so on and so forth. I was on vacation / like shadowing abroad in China. And I was like, and then I went to Japan to like travel because all of this was pre-COVID. And I was like, screw this, I'm going to enjoy my vacation. And I came home and I turned in most of my secondaries like 6 to 8 weeks after. And like, I still got plenty of interviews. So don't stress about that. Anyway, all that aside, the reason you want to turn it in early is so that schools interview you early, because most interviews are offered on a rolling basis. And what's really nice about getting interviewed early is that you get accepted early for the schools that do rolling interviews. And when you get accepted somewhere, then you can turn down interviews from places that you wouldn't rather go to. And in the non-COVID era, when flying out and like living at places to do an interview is very, very expensive, that becomes extremely advantageous. So that is I think, and then interviews, I predated Maebelle by 1 year, and I was pre-MMI era for UNC. So I had like a traditional interview, except the way my day went, because I was on campus, they like emailed me the morning of. They were like, we know the interview day starts at 10:30, but can you come in like beforehand just because you're here? And like there was a scheduling issue with one of your interviewers. So I came in early. I was told by everyone like, oh, UNC's interview is so conversational. Everyone just chats. I was like absolutely grilled by like the former dean of the medical school or something. I was like, okay, all right. So anything can happen. It doesn't mean you won't get in, because I still got into UNC. I'm just saying, like, your interview experience may not be what people tell you, and it can still be fine. So that's sort of the piece of wisdom there. But the formats vary. Maebelle talked a little bit about speed dating MMIs, which was the case at a couple of places I went. Other places did more traditional, like you talk to 2 to 3 people for like 30 minutes each. And you have tours and I have no idea what it's like in the Zoom era, but traditionally, like, tours, and you wander around and you eat and interact with people, and it's very fun. So that's medical school applications. Maebelle, did I miss anything? Excellent. Okay, so medical school. So this is something I didn't know, and people like alluded to, and I was extremely confused by the entire time I was an undergrad. Your board certification comes in a series of 3 exams. Step 1 is basic clinical knowledge, or basic science knowledge, honestly. Most of it will not be pertinent to your practice. And for you guys, it's going to be a pass-fail exam, which is wonderful, unlike it was for us, which was painful. But you take this test, you pass this test. And then the second step is step 2, which is more on clinical knowledge, emphasizing like diagnosis, not treatment, diagnosis. And so you take this entire boards exam. It's another extensive and exorbitantly expensive tests that you have to take and pass. And then step 3, there's 3 steps. Step 3, you actually don't take until residency, which none of this was explained to me in advance. So I'm just letting you all know, because all of this was a massive black box. So that is the process of getting, making sure that you're board certified or what have you. But actually applying for residency, so the way the timeline works is September of your 4th year, or whatever year you graduate, if you take an extra year. The primary application, which is the only application, God bless, I know, right, is turned in. And that consists of sort of like, the standard stuff, like your activities. No one really cares about your activities, which is actually kind of nice, because you don't feel like you have to stay busy all the time. But you turn in your grades, you turn in your board scores, you talk about your research, whatever else you happen to do during medical school, et cetera, like sort of the standard form thing. And then you have a personal statement that you will be strongly encouraged to keep it within 1 page, because no one will flip to the second page, talking about why you want to apply to your residency of choice. I was asked my process of picking a specialty, and sort of to touch on that a little bit. I actually came in thinking about ENT because I shadowed when I was at UNC, more or less arbitrarily. I just came across the name. I was like, what on earth is that? And I was able to finagle my way into a shadowing position, and I thought it was cool. I did my clinical rotations. The first one I did was OBGYN. My first 4 days were on GYN oncology. I was in the OR all 4 days. And at the end of it, I was like, well, it's going to be surgery. So that's going to be that. And then beyond that point, like I said, really what it came down to was that I've been to almost every classical case for every surgical subspecialty. I played bingo with the OR. Anyway, I've seen every case. And I think what I took away from it is I'm happy as long as I'm operating, but it's really the diseases and the pathologies in ENT that I find most compelling. And so that kind of was what sealed it. It's not really, I didn't have the classic, someone in my family had head and neck cancer. Like that really wasn't my story at any point. But I do think it's some of the smaller subspecialties, that's sort of the expectation that like you might not know someone with this disease process, and that's okay. You might just like the specialty. Not that it is required for any subspecialty, but at any rate, I digress. Interviews. So interviews get released. They are very specialty dependent. Each one has a different culture of when interviews are released. Like the collective season runs between, I want to say, end of October and beginning of February, but internal medicine residencies tend to interview on the earlier end. A lot of surgical subs tend to interview on the later end. And it's very specialty dependent. It's also very specialty dependent how much sort of somewhat behind the scenes communication happens. In the smaller fields, there are fewer positions. Everyone knows each other. So the letters of recommendation end up being really, really important. And the, like, you know, sort of your clinical grades on internal medicine, for example, for us is slightly less important because it's just not quite as salient to what we do and what shows what would make you a good resident. So you go in and you do your interviews. For most surgical subspecialties, they are more MMI style. It's like most of them are 2-on-1. And you're there for like 10 to 15 minutes, which with each room, and you rotate through most of the chairs of departments and like major teaching faculty within the specialty. What I've heard from my friends applying into medicine is that their interviews tend to be more like spend like 45 minutes with the same person, or like spend 30 minutes with the same person. It's more of like a traditional long form interview. But for us, you talk to basically everyone in the department. And then the way the match work is, it's for any math nerds out there, it's the stable marriage problem algorithm that they use. Basically, you put in your list of places that you want to go, the programs put in their rank order of who they want. A magical algorithm runs in the background. And on match day, which is March 18th, you get an envelope telling you where you're going to be for the next X number of years of your life. And the Monday preceding that, you're told whether or not you're unemployed, so that you will know whether or not you get a name in the envelope on Friday. So yeah, that's basically it. And obviously I'm on the tail end of that and hoping to hear that I'm not unemployed come March 14th. So yeah, kind of a whirlwind tour. You are all free to email me if you have any specific questions, but aside from Maebelle, I think for most of you, the residency application stuff is like way, way off in the future.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was amazing. So I'm conscious of time here. We have about 25 minutes left, and I know that I have some individual questions for each of the panelists, but I also want to open up the floor to the participants and see if anybody has any questions. You're welcome to just unmute yourself, go ahead and ask, or you're also welcome to just throw your question into the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. But I do want to open the floor to the participants first before I continue to yammer on with my own questions. So it looks like we have one from Aaron asking, would you recommend that classes in medical humanities be added to the curriculum in health professional schools? And anyone who would like to handle that question is welcome to.
Yes. I mean, I think there were a lot in my program, and I know they're increasing courses in medical schools. I'm not sure about nursing schools as much, but, you know, I think it's definitely an important thing to be involved in curriculum, even if it isn't like a designated course, trying to weave it into other classes within curriculum.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd definitely say yes. And I also do think medical schools are starting to add that into their curriculum. And I think that was also like part of how I chose which schools I wanted to apply to. Like I wanted to go somewhere that emphasized kind of the same values that I had. But at UNC, for example, in your first year, you have a class called Social and Health Systems. And every week you meet and you have discussions on various health humanities or social and topics. And then like every year that you're in medical school, you have some version of that social and health systems class. It's probably not talked about as much as it should be, but at least it's starting to be talked about.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. I think with Natalie and I both mentioning that we're the ones that get a lot of the difficult patients that no one else wants to deal with. I think UNC and these humanities classes have prepared us for that. And I don't know on the nursing side if they've like implemented that, but I can say we get a lot of UNC medical students that will do their rotations up in the STICU, and I'm like so excited for them to become doctors. They're the best, most holistic people and interdisciplinary collaborative medical professionals we get to work with. So I think from seeing how UNC med students interact with patients, it's just, I think they're doing a great job. If not, they could do more, but they're amazing.
And I'm going to jump in real quick just to add too that I think this tension between like what is there room for in the clinical curriculum versus not, and how do we fit all of this in is in part why health humanities is moving back in some ways to the baccalaureate like level or the undergraduate level. And that's where a lot of this foundation happens to set you up to find the mentors who are practicing the kind of medicine or clinical work that you admire and want to emulate. So there's my plug for all of our curricula at the undergraduate level.
So Hannah, I wanted to ask what places in your working environment and in your sort of day-to-day routine where you wish there was more inclusion of a health humanities perspective. So you talked a lot about incorporating spiritual care and kind of serving as this communicative and sort of emotional bridge between patients and families, between patients and physicians. I'm wondering, where like in more of the nitty gritty of your routine, do you kind of stop and think like, I wish that there was more of a like interdisciplinary approach to this particular situation or this environment?
Yeah, I think on a personal aspect of what I do day to day is when I do have like a family that's a little overbearing where I can't focus on doing what I need to do clinically, I try and implement my other resources like I talked about in spiritual care and sitting down and being like, okay, like I've done everything I need to do clinically. Let me sit down with this patient or let me sit down with this family and go over all the education we need to, or how can I figure out what is going to calm them down, or because the more people understand what's going on, the more relaxed they seem to feel. And then from a research aspect, what I'm trying to implement is whenever we have a patient that we kind of are close to declaring brain dead or anything, or when we're going to implement a life care, or I think it's called like life share, when we're going to donate someone's organs, we will trigger them or contact them when a person reaches a certain GCS or Glasgow Coma Scale sedation awakeness kind of measurement. So I'm trying to implement when a person reaches that level where we're contacting life share or contacting a certain measurement of life death in a certain brain aspect, just automatically triggering that person, just like we would automatically trigger other type of clinical aspects. So that humanities part, or that human part of healthcare, is just a part of our routine as opposed to something we need to actively kind of think about.
Yeah, I think I love the way that you articulated that. And I think that it's a crucial distinction of wanting that like health humanities perspective or understanding to just be part of the routine instead of something that we're constantly hoping or pushing to be sort of like supplemented, inserted into this clinical environment, this clinical routine. So I hope that eventually, as we're talking about, these classes are being offered more, and I hope that continues to move forward and become more of a routine rather than like a choice to include it constantly over and over and over again. Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to ask, kind of in a similar vein, I wanted to ask Natalie where you've seen, and I know you kind of touched on, there are times where you have to like remind yourself like, okay, this is not my life, this is not, my experience, and I have to kind of check my own either biases or like preferences. And I'm wondering where you've seen sort of like ethical quandaries that might be similar to those presented in curriculum that you studied in health humanities courses, and how those have shown up in your work as a genetic counselor.
Yeah, we all the time end up with different ethical issues. So most commonly for me, I sit on exome data, so data on all 20,000 genes in the body for 3,000 patients, some of whom I know really, really well, some of whom I don't really know that well. So that, we study a very narrow subset of diseases, but that contains data on risk of developing neurological disease later in life, things like Alzheimer's, things like Parkinson's, Huntington's, you know, it contains information on family relationships. I've had more than a handful of patients where family members weren't as expected. So figuring out how to handle that data is one of the big ethical things that I work with. You know, what do we disclose when? And even when something has been found or disclosed to a family, you know, communicating within families. Do parents want to withhold information from a child that could be relevant to them later on? Or does a parent want to make decisions about a pregnancy termination? A lot of those different issues, you know, I kind of have to think about on a semi-regular basis. And I think a lot of that directly came up in some of my classes at UNC, but also, you know, that sort of framework for how to think through big philosophical issues helps me kind of work through what we should do in the clinic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Navigating that really difficult line of knowing that you're receiving information that is essential for you to receive, and also figuring out, okay, who am I like ethically allowed to share this information with? When is it going to be constructive, and when is it going to cause more harm than it would be helpful? And sometimes it sounds like sometimes it's both. It is going to cause harm, and also it is essential that you share it. And that seems like that would be one of the most difficult situations. So Ermak brought up in the chat, I'd love to hear everyone talk a little bit more about what you do to take care of yourselves after caring for others and having difficult conversations with your patients and their families. Yeah, I think that's an amazing question, and a really key like topic that's undergirding our whole conversation tonight. Of you're in a lot of really difficult roles all the time, day to day. So yeah, I think that would be a great question to end on for everyone to address.
I can go first, but I think I will have the least to contribute just because I haven't started rotations yet. So I haven't necessarily had a whole bunch of difficult conversations with patients and families. But I do think it's been really important to me to kind of find those strategies now and earlier, so that when I go into what's going to be difficult, both because it's just a difficult time in like medical education, and also all the other things happening in the world, and also having these difficult conversations, or just seeing death and seeing really sick people and interacting with them and caring for them. So I make sure I have people that I know I can call when I feel like I need someone to talk to. I've been working on journaling, and I downloaded the Headspace app, and I'm working on that. I think I did very similar things during AmeriCorps. Thank you for reminding me. During AmeriCorps, I think I called parents because it was my first time away from home. So I would call my parents. I would hang out with other people in the cohort. I would dance a lot. I just basically found outlets for me to either process what I had been doing or escape from what I'd been doing for a little bit, whichever one was most needed at the time.
Absolutely, thank you. Natalie or Anne or Hannah, you want to jump in?
I feel like this sounds so Grey's Anatomy when I tell people what I do when I'm at work, but sometimes when you hear the most offlandish things or the craziest things people have to say, I definitely, and a lot of my coworkers will go into the supply room and break tongue depressors. Like that is definitely something that happens. And then I know for me, like I definitely have to work out before I go to work, which is sometimes difficult, but just kind of finding that thing that kind of gives you those extra endorphins, and then being able to go, okay, everything's fine. Like at the end of the day, I'm not the person in that bed. I get to go home to my puppy, and always kind of understanding that that's not me in that bed. And I have to remember that. And everyone's dealing with a bunch of things.
Anne, would you like to take it away?
Sure. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to have hard conversations, as simplistic as that sounds. And I think a lot of kind of just being okay with things, actually, a lot of it has a little to do with the work that I did with Dr. Thrailkill on her Agony of Empathy project, which really, like, I mean, her central thesis, if you haven't heard about it yet, is basically that, like, the root of all of our angst about empathy is not that we are not empathic enough. It's that we feel guilty about not being some like idealistic monolith of like what an empathic person looks like and how that's just utter nonsense, right? Because you are who you are, you care about your patients, and like stuff gets in the way because medicine is hard and life is hard, and you know that's okay. You know, you're not perfect because you're a clinician. You just kind of got to do your best and forgive yourself when you're not perfect. And I think that just having that grace for yourself, that like there is no good that comes from dwelling on yourself in the moment of that patient interaction and feeling like, oh my gosh, if I make a misstep and I don't use the perfect word. And I feel like with our humanities background, we feel a little more of the pressure to like find the perfect word because that's so much of like what we do, right? And what we are theoretically very good at. But I mean, patients have, and their families have a wonderful BS detector, and they notice when you care, you know, like even if the right words don't come out, at the end of the day, like what you say and how you say it is so secondary to the experience of actually being that patient in their bed or being the loved one of that patient in their bed, that if you care, if you fumble a bit, you know, your love comes through and it's fine. And they see that you care about them. And so just, I don't know, I guess lending yourself a little bit of grace that like, you're not going to always get it right. And that's okay. It is what it is. And having also the other part of that, just having really wonderful colleagues. I think the other thing that drew me to ENT was that I love the people. Everyone's so nice. And just having, you know, being in a medical family where you feel like you can say like, this is a crappy thing that I did today. Like I lost my temper at the person who consulted me because I was very tired and they wanted me to check on a nosebleed that had stopped and it was 3 a.m. You know, people who will listen to that and say, you know, that happens, and not like, oh my gosh, you're an awful human being. That goes a long way as well.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think that's a really crucial thing to name and isn't always talked about when we think about self-care, or when we think about, and I know there's a lot of quotations around self-care because that's now become like a bubble word. But yeah, just acknowledging that you're not always going to get it right. And that's not fun to experience in the moment, but it's also, we're all human and we're all trying everything that we can, and you have the best intentions. So I think being transparent and being able to be transparent with other people is like, yeah, I really messed up today and I don't feel good about it. But I'm going to have to let it go and figure out a way to let it go. And I think that in a medical context, especially when it feels like the stakes are so much higher than in a lot of spheres, it's really, really hard to have that acceptance. And also even just to name it out loud. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. Natalie, do you want to round us out?
Sure. Yeah, so I sort of have framework for self-care through a couple of different, ways. I have a group of friends who are also genetic counselors, so I can text with really difficult cases or, just vent in the moment. I'm really lucky at my work. We have a group that we call supervision, but it's kind of like counseling for counselors. So we meet every month or so and can talk about difficult cases, things we're dealing with, even like issues with coworkers, not even patient things, which has been really helpful to kind of have people who are in a similar, position to me weigh in. And then when I was in grad school, one of my favorite things that our advisors did was we always had a non-academic goal. And every single advisor meeting, they would check in, it would be like, how are you doing in classes? How are you doing with your patients? Did you cook your recipe that you're supposed to cook every week? Or did you hit, I'm a rock climber, so it was always, did you hit a good score on good graded climb? So that's something that I kind of keep up in my personal life, where it's like, all right, am I doing my non-academic goals as a grown-up? So yeah.
I love that. I think that that's definitely something that one of the seminars that I was in had something similar of like, doing sort of an icebreaker of like what's an academic goal, and then what's something that is not academic that you have that you really want to accomplish this semester. And it was great to share, and it also felt so much more vulnerable in a lot of ways, because it can be very intimidating to admit in a like space that is not normally for like discussing those things, to be like, yeah, I really want to achieve this like 8-minute mile or whatever it is. But I think it is very cathartic and feels really good to be able to share that in a space that is not normally, that's not always on the priority list. So thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. It was great to have each and every one of you. And thank you for being so thoughtful with your answers and candid. And yeah, we really appreciate it.